Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I was just mentioning at my table earlier, this seems to be my Smart Cities day with legal experts. I was at a forum earlier this morning where we were convening at Norton Rose Fulbright to talk about smart city and data sets, especially within the context of sharing large data sets across multiple partners and how you structure those agreements, how you manage privacy. And I'm here speaking with a number of experts this afternoon. So I'm excited to continue on that theme. So just to introduce myself, Sasha Sood, I'm from Mars. Mars, not the planet, of course, but Mars Discovery District. Mars Discovery District is located here in Toronto, just at University and College, just north of us. We have about 1.5 million square feet where we convene corporate partners who are tenants and about 1,400 startups that work in that space. We have clients like Facebook, Johnson & Johnson Labs, Samsung, amongst others. And we are oversubscribed in our building in terms of the demand for this type of programming and space. So we're actually building a second innovation center at the waterfront, which will add another 400,000 square feet by 2021. So if I had to summarize what Mars does, just to give you all context on why I'm here, we do three things. We support ventures, so we support startups, who might range anywhere from an idea that somebody has to over $5 million in revenue. We support partners, so we have corporate partners, large global corporates, governments, regulators, to help them adapt to and adopt innovative technologies or emerging technologies and innovative solutions. And we help with catalyzing that adoption across for those partners to help them adapt to them. And then finally, a lot of times innovation happens in highly complex, heavily regulated, and multi-stakeholder environments, which is really challenging for a startup to be able to move if they have a new idea around how they want to apply their technology or solution. And this stands true for corporates as well. So we're often involved in convening stakeholders, governments, corporates, startups, civic society, to make sure that we have a fulsome conversation around what are the changes across the system, across regulations, across business models, across civic needs, to make sure that the solutions that are developed and rolled out into marketplace actually have all of those angles reflected so that they can last and go forward in a more sustainable way. So this slide basically shows you the 5 sectors that we work across. We work across health tech, clean tech, fintech, enterprise scale solutions, and we create platforms for enabling large scale technologies. You'll notice smart cities isn't specifically called out here, and that we see as something that's an underlying layer across all of these sectors, and in a combined way or at the nexus between health tech and mobility tech, you'll see a smart city application, and that's sort of how that applies. We support ventures across 5 different size categories, and so at the start stage, we have companies between 0 and $1 million in revenue, where we provide one-to-many support, where we'll have one advisor providing educational programming or advisory support. We do that at no cost to the ventures across all 3 sectors. And we do that for grow companies who are $1 to $5 million in revenue, where we have a one-to-few advisory system where advisors who are experts in their particular field advise companies on how to grow and scale. And then we have the scale model where we provide one-to-one support on helping our large companies grow to over $100 million in revenue. I spoke briefly about supporting partners, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. But this slide isn't intended to be exhaustive, but it's getting pretty full, I know that. But what I was trying to do here was just to give you a breadth of the types of stakeholders we're involved in. So you'll see a lot of cities, you'll see governments, you'll see ministries, you'll see large corporate partners who all come to us to help them adapt to and adopt to disruptive technologies. And we work with those partners to drive some of that work. And we do that in sort of 4 key categories. We help curate access to an innovation community where we invite some of our partners to come to events where they're meeting with like-minded people, talking about common challenges or opportunity areas. And the Norton Rose example I gave earlier was an example of that. We had healthcare providers, we had mobility providers, we had a CPG company, all within the room to talk about the role that sensors and technology and the data that's generated from them, how you can start to collaborate with the sharing of that data to unlock new market opportunities and civic value. We have an innovation pipeline process where a company can come to us and say, we're looking to solve this particular problem to help build this particular product. And so we have highly structured processes where we mine our 1,400 companies to find companies either who have that solution or the capability to develop that solution based on the criteria that the corporate partners have identified. And what we do quite uniquely is because of our intimate knowledge of the ventures, we're able to help them, help corporate partners match up with ventures who meet their need exactly. And we increase the success rate of follow-on conversations quite substantially. And then the last piece I'll talk about is corporate innovation. So we help large corporate entities, governments, regulators to essentially create innovation governance frameworks within those organizations that allow for innovative ideas and products and services to be developed. And one example, and there are many that I like to mention, is when you think about an engineer at Microsoft actually discovered the touch screen. And he took it to his manager and said, hey, I discovered this really cool feature. It's the touch screen. It might have some interesting applications. The manager said, this is not going to go anywhere, and it was shelved. 2 years later, Apple took that same technology and came out with the iPhone. And we know how things stand today in terms of the applicability of the iPhone. There's similar examples when you think about Kodak, who invented the digital camera the first time, and then they said, we're in the film business, this is not going to go anywhere. And now we know where Kodak is, and you can talk about Blockbuster, and there's many other examples that you can think about. The last slide I'll talk about, Mars, is just about enabling systems. I won't go through the entire process, but we have a highly structured approach to help change highly complex systems, adapt to disruptive technologies. And I can give some examples of that as we go through the presentation. So before we dive into smart cities, let's talk about the context within which we need to think about smart cities, and maybe even think about a definition for smart cities, because it means many different things to many different people. And just in terms of the context, I mean, we're all experiencing this firsthand in cities. Canada is actually one of the world's most urbanized cities globally. In fact, a lot of companies come to Mars because they want to test the solutions in a highly urbanized environment and then take that into other marketplaces that are urbanizing. So we're a really good playground for testing these technologies or solutions. Urbanization is a global phenomenon where more and more people are looking to move into and live on less and less space. They're generating 70% of the world's greenhouse gases and consuming 2/3 of the world's energy. They're also becoming centers of inequality. And the graphic on the right really shows what's happening in Toronto, what's happened in Toronto over 25 years, where you're seeing inequity increase between low-income and high-income people, and the middle-income folks are getting squeezed less and less and less. So the yellow represents the middle income. See where we started in the 1970s and where we are in 2005. This has actually gotten worse. And this is not unique to us. This is a function of how we're living in urbanized cities and societies. And so with that context in mind, one of the things that does is it actually impacts people's lives daily. We were doing a study recently where we actually found out that a lot of students in university are picking their courses not based on what they want to be, but based on bus schedules. We're finding people are not able to get to their jobs even though they want jobs because there isn't a reasonable way to get across given the compounding congestion we're seeing in dense urban regions. And with our population forecast, we're supposed to see 40% increase by 2040 just within the GTHA. That problem is going to get worse before it gets better. And for us, what smart cities means is how do you start to solve for these highly complex problems through the use of the right types of problem framing and definition, the right types of civic engagement, and then ultimately the application of technology to solve for these problems. Quite often, some would argue we've actually ended up in this space because we've taken a technology first approach, and a lot of our thesis is focused on how do you start to apply the technology last. And it's quite ironic from a smart cities person saying we're going to be looking to apply technology last, but we really need to take a problem-based approach to when we start to apply technologies or solutions to the marketplace. Let's not build solutions that are looking for problems. So here's a crack at our definition for what a smart city is. Smart cities engage communities, and that means engagements with key stakeholders, civic society, subject area experts, and leverage technology in innovative ways. And by innovative, I mean not just through the application of technology, but innovative partnerships, innovative business models, and innovative technologies, and innovative procurement processes. If you think about government, there's a whole new opportunity on how we procure services that can drive different outcomes than what we achieve today. To address growing urban challenges like the ones I mentioned briefly, and generating positive outcomes for society. And so what I mean by positive outcomes is, obviously there's the economic angle for folks who are investing in those technologies or services, but there's also a social component, there's also environmental component to the solutions we're developing. And we're seeing very, I think in real time, what happens when you only look at one particular perspective. And that's being played out at Sidewalk Labs, where that's generating a lot of conversation around social involvement, civic society, the role they play, the need for people to be consulted on how their information is being used, and what type of resistance that can create and what kind of discord that can create if you don't take a holistic approach. So we work to facilitate those types of conversations, and I'll give some examples of that later on. So to make this a bit more fun, because I know you've all had dessert and you've had a pretty full day, I made up some headlines. And I made up some headlines just to illustrate the different types of futures we could be headed to, depending on the regulatory, the legal constructs, the business models that we create for ourselves to define what type of society we want to head towards. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I promise I'll bring it back to real things that we're working on, and I'm sure you all are working on in specific aspects of the work that you do. So I'm not going to read out everything, but I'll let you read the headlines and take a pause for a moment. So on the left-hand side, I think some of the text is missing. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that you could have some very positive outcomes based on how we apply technology to drive efficiencies and how things move to create unique business models that make things convenient, more responsive. And then on the right-hand side, you see a technology-first approach where you could end up with some unintended consequences when you don't think through the entire implication of applying a particular technology. And some key considerations as you think about that particular use case are, we're in a world where we're talking about the digitization of everything. And in our definition of smart cities, I talked about the application of technology It could also be just the digitization of the solutions or the products that we're looking at. And so what that leads to is a conversation around how do we collect data, how do we access data, how do we share data to drive a lot of these opportunities, to drive efficiencies, to create new products and services, to create new, more responsive services. Data is going to be a key component of how some of these solutions get built, get applied, how some of these problems get solved. And there's many different conversations that I'm sure you all are engaged in around data trust as a model for collecting sensor data and then making that available to different stakeholders to solve problems, to create new products. Data exchanges, which is sort of literally what the name supports. It's a private entity that manages multiple data sets and you pay into it or you exchange one data set for the other. And then as you start to think about data sets and data exchanges, how do you manage consent within that context? If, I'm just going to make up an example, Healthcare Ontario collected my health information 25 years ago on a piece of paper, and now that's been digitized, that gets fed into a data exchange or a data trust. How do you make sure that the information that I consented to 25 years ago, I provided the right consent for it to be used to develop pharmaceuticals, for it to be used to track trends in disease evolution, for it to be able to, I'm just making stuff up, solve cancer. How do you make sure you get meaningful consent when you're looking at aggregated data sets that are collected over time? So these are some of the types of challenges that we are working with governments, with corporate partners to help solve and decipher. And some very real conversations that are happening in the city here today, but I'm sure are happening across Ontario and we know are happening across the world. I think the Toronto example was the Quayside announcement that came out recently. For those of you who may not be familiar, Sidewalk Labs, a Google Alphabet company subsidiary, has proposed to build a smart city in Quayside in eastern Toronto. They've had very innovative ideas around how they collect data, how they apply technology to create better products and services and better outcomes for individuals. But that's generated a lot of conversation around who gets access to the data, what can it be used for, who owns the data, how do you get meaningful consent when the data is being collected? And there's a lot of active discussion happening around these topic areas in the region. Again, I'm missing a couple of headlines on the left-hand side. I apologize. That might have been lost in translation. But on the left-hand side, you're basically seeing the types of challenges you can see when you apply technology without thinking of the unintended consequences. That's the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you can see how it can be applied for good if you're looking at creating, what's it called? Vision Zero, which in Toronto is, having no accidents. Our mayor has wanted to address the amount of collisions we're seeing within the city. You can have planned AV pilots that can help advance the rollout of autonomous vehicles. And those would be some of the use cases that you could, different features that you could end up with. Key considerations around those are, with the rapid rate of change of technology and the different thesis around how that's going to roll out, how do you have regulations keep pace with the technological changes and manage the regulatory compliance burden that comes with that? I think I've got a slide here on the right from Thomson Reuters, which talks about the increasing costs and burden of compliance that companies or businesses face in meeting changing requirements based on technological changes. We're having some conversations with the government right now who are looking to reduce regulatory burden. I think there's even a associate minister of red tape right now who we are in discussions with to see how can you start to drive some efficiencies there. But this is a very real topic, and this is going to get this is going to get quite complex as we move forward. So in that type of an environment, how can you think about things like smart contracts that automate how information gets shared, how it gets paid for, how you collect consent? How can you use things like machine-readable regulation that allows for the updating of that information based on a common source of truth, based on machines reading the regulation and then deriving outputs or insights that can then be applied to particular use cases? I came across a startup in the UK which was basically a chatbot that was able to read, I think it was the UK's Financial Conduct Authority's machine readable regulations, and you could basically have a conversation with the chatbot which would read the most up-to-date regulatory change that was made through the regulation and then tell you what the answer to a particular use case or challenge was around solving for that. And as technology starts to change at a faster and faster pace, we have to find tools to help us keep up with some of those technological challenges. And some of the concepts that we're coming across now are around these machine-readable regulations, and then rules as code. And one interesting example of, or a couple of interesting examples that I've heard of and not interacted with directly is, can you have regulation around reducing congestion in a city like Toronto that's very real, where New York's gone ahead and banned the number of Ubers and Lyfts and vehicles that can provide ride-hailing services. The premise being that it takes one person from point A to point B, and to get to that one person, there's 0 passengers in the car. So you're actually using the vehicle really inefficiently to provide that service to that one individual. And the sort of alternate, rules as code approach to this could be, can you start to build in code into the vehicles with sensors on the seats to say whether they're occupied or not occupied, to say if you are traveling more than 30% of your journeys with one person or less than one person in a ride-hailing configuration, so an on-demand transportation service, you will have to take a pause during rush hour. Right? So if you've been operating at that point, and that code and that regulation is built into the vehicle so that the vehicle is not allowed to move or get into specific parts of the city if it doesn't comply with those regulatory requirements. So that's the type of application that we're starting to hear people think about, talk about, prototype, test, and those might be some of the types of conversations you're engaged in as well. This particular slide is basically showing that congestion example that I was referring to earlier. You can have two very different types of outcomes, and if we just think about the volumes of people that are looking to move into dense urban regions, there's no way we can build out of it. Even if we started spending inordinate amounts of money, we couldn't build highways or roads fast enough, or even transit systems fast enough to meet the rate of change that we're going to experience. So we have to change the dynamic of how people move, or the efficiency around how people move. And to start to do that, we need to start to define what some of those outcomes are that we want technology to achieve, as opposed to have technology dictate what sort of outcomes that's going to drive. And these slides are just, again, illustrative purposes only, but I think they help identify how we can be more deliberate about the types of futures we want to be headed into. And so with regards to AVs in particular, I know we have some folks from the auto insurance industry who work actively in that space. How do you manage liability with the introduction of AV fleets that offer mobility as a service type solutions, where if an autonomous vehicle has an accident, is the mobility as a service provider, so is Uber or Lyft or another company providing that sort of service liable? Is it the automotive OEM, so is GM, Ford, Tesla, and others liable for how the autonomous vehicle behaves? And what starts to happen when you have an autonomous vehicle and an individual who are involved in a collision, and how do you sort of navigate those types of exchanges or changes when a collision happens? And those things are becoming more and more real. I know we're not at full automation today, but a lot of new vehicles have semi-automated capabilities like lane change, like accident prevention. But then where's the training for passengers and licensing requirements to be aware of the technology that's already in the car and what you can and cannot do as a vehicle, as a passenger or driver in a semi-automated vehicle? Those things are happening at rapid paces, but we haven't seen changes to how we regulate and oversee the adoption of these technologies to drive the particular outcomes that we're looking to drive. So those may be interesting sort of conversations for folks who are engaged in this space. The other interesting conversation that we've seen sort of in this context is around the ethics of machines making decisions around how what lives they protect, what lives they put at risk when there is an unavoidable circumstance. So this graphic at the bottom right, where a machine is driving the vehicle, has to make a decision because of some unforeseen circumstances. Does it collide into the car and endanger the people in the car and the people in the vehicle? Does it collide into an elderly person, or does it collide into a regular person, or maybe does it collide into a baby or a mom with a baby crossing the stroller? Because technology can allow you to evaluate all of those permutations, combinations in the split second. How do you decide which life or lives are worth more, and how do you govern how those decisions are made? So those are some of the ethical challenges that maybe some programmers making on our behalf, and maybe we want to take a more deliberate approach to how those decisions get made. And one of the interesting things we learned through some research that we were doing was the answers to these questions on which life you save versus which life you don't are highly culturally, contextually sensitive. So in one country, somebody would say, we must protect the elderly and the wisdom and the insights that they can bring to society. In some countries, they would index towards children, and in some countries, it would be the person in the car, of course. So the answers to these questions are highly nuanced and highly subject or use case specific based on where these things are happening. So how do we start to make decisions around how these things are decided upon as we go forward? I'm going to do a quick time check just to make sure. I have lots of examples that I can go to make sure there's time for Q&A. So we've got about 5 minutes. So maybe we'll do Q&A in the 5 minutes just to have a dialogue, and I can always make the slides available. There's some examples that we've been engaged in, or maybe I'll go through one example. We've talked about sidewalk labs, and I think everybody talks about sidewalk labs. I'll talk about an automotive car manufacturer. They're called Forcia. They've been a Mars partner since 2017. 1 in 3 cars globally has their technology. It's either a car seat or an interior. And they basically picked up from France and came to Mars, Toronto, because they were seeing that in their future forecast, they were going to sell less vehicles because they're going to be shared, they're going to be running in fleets. And so they wanted to start to identify new areas of value that they could use to grow their business. And so what we were engaged in doing with them was identifying what are some niche areas where you could start to create different solutions for them to future-proof themselves and their business. And one area that we landed on based on consultations and primary and secondary research was health data acquisition and sharing, urban and rural health-related mobility as a service, and aging and mobility were going to be huge opportunity areas and or challenge areas that we are all going to face as a society as time progresses. And so what we've been working on with them is basically creating a digital wellness program where your health outcome is better after you finish a car ride than when you entered it. So what that translates to is when you enter your car has cameras in it, it has sensors in it that can test for stress levels, that can test your blood pressure, that can tell if you're about to have a stroke, that can, give you treatments that help you address those particular challenges. So this is not just talking about an autonomous future where you have a driverless car. You could have a car where you can start to do facial mapping and see if a person is stressed, and start to apply mood changes, sound changes, massage features that get activated based on how you're reacting to within a car. More importantly, some of the business models that we're exploring, and that's where the concept of sharing data with multiple parties comes in, is you can also start to, and we're starting to have conversations with healthcare providers, can you get rid of the triage system if you can collect all of that biometric data within the vehicle and just drive in to your particular specialist that you need to see based on the symptoms that you have or the basic biometric information that you've collected. Huge efficiencies there, both to the healthcare system and to the outcomes that the patient will be experiencing. Can you start to drive better insurance rates or collision outcomes if you can start to share some of that information? If the car takes control when it knows you're going to have an acute event like a heart attack or a stroke, are there things that we can start to do which, A, prevent that collision from happening, B, notify EMS or emergency services that, similar to technology we have today in cars where a beacon goes off and EMS knows where to come. That technology exists today. So can you start to create data sharing pathways where you can have multiple parties getting access to the data to unlock value for that? And how you manage privacy through that entire process, how do you manage consent through that entire process, and how do you manage IP through that entire process are some of the key challenges, opportunities that we're seeing and working with partners such as Forcia as they develop these technologies and products and services. So I'll stop here, I think, just as an example of the types of work we're engaged in.
To make our way back over, but I just wanted to thank you very much.